Gresham College presents Debussy, Text and Ideas. Reflections on the new edition of Pelléas by Professor David Grayson.
Pelléas and Mélisande, the first title is David Grayson talking about reflections on the new edition of Pelléas. You may have heard various of us talking about the œuvre complète, and I thought I'd just take a minute to tell you what that is, which is the new complete edition of Debussy's works, aiming, there's some being waved around there. They have that distinctive blue cover, and they are very, very authoritative in that they list every single thing that we can know about those pieces from the point of view of manuscripts and performance and some reception history and so on. They're also extremely expensive.
These are cheaper than Henley.
Yeah, but they're very, yes, they've got soft covers now. So
They're the soft cover of prints, and the expensive ones are half paid for by the French government. They still cost less than Berenreich hardback.
there you are. Well, they're cheaper than German editions and better. So look out for them and get them to order for your library. David Grayson has been responsible for the mammoth task of editing Pelléas and Mélisande, which I suppose must be Debussy's longest work. And
No, Martyr.
yeah.
Martyr is one.
Oh, the Martyr de Saint-Sebastian, maybe, yeah. Collar David, and he will tell you some extraordinary stories about parts suddenly being rediscovered. But I'll hand him over to you. You've got his biography, so I'm not going to give the parade of his life. I might get it wrong.
Thank you. The last time that I saw Nadia Boulanger, I told her that I was in Paris to begin work on my doctoral dissertation on Pelléas. That was about a century ago. Have you memorized it? She asked. This is was one of her maddening traits as a teacher, reminding us always of what we should and could do if only we had the necessary will and discipline. I confess that I hadn't, and I still haven't. So after an appropriately long Debussyan silence, during which she gave me time to ponder my shortcomings, we moved on to other things. What she was curious to learn was what music I had heard recently, meaning I was to discover new music. When I told her that I had just seen Massenet's Werther at the Paris Opera, she was positively dismayed. I had disappointed her once again. Now moving on to the paper. No matter how well one knows a work, one cannot rely on memory when making a critical edition, especially of a long and complex work like Pelléas, which had such a complicated and protracted genesis, and for which there are a great many sources associated with numerous editions, and the numerous performances supervised by the composer. Details and variants need to be documented and controlled, many more than will eventually be listed in the critical notes. There, the editor will offer not everything he has discovered, no matter how interesting it may seem to him, but what he thinks the score's users will need to know. Debussy would certainly not have disappointed Mademoiselle Boulanger. For among other things, while he was composing Pelléas, he had evidently memorized his libretto, which is to say, the Maeterlinck play from which he drew his text. We may infer as much from his preliminary sketches, in which the vocal melodies are for the most part written without their sung texts. And there we go. And here's a page of the sketch, the beginning of Act 5, where you can see there's Artkel is there, the character singing, but you don't see a word of text. And when I claim that he memorized the play, rather than the cut version of it that he fashioned into his libretto, it is because the first draft of the first scene that he composed, his Act 4, Scene 4, included every word of the play, or nearly every word. The exceptions, as they say, prove the rule, as only 2 words were changed. When Pelléas says, "On est triste souvent quand on s'aime," one is sad often when one loves, Mélisande readily agrees with overstatement, so strong is her impulse to please. "Je pleure toujours lorsque je songe à toi." I weep always when I think of you. Here, Debussy changed songe to pense, a subtle switch that leaves the translation unaltered. Perhaps the difference is between thinking about and thinking of. Then, later in the scene, after Pelléas and Mélisande become aware that Golo saw them kissing, Pelléas comments, "Il restera là tant qu'il croira que nous ne savons pas." He will remain there as long as he thinks we do not know. Debussy changed savant to voyant, from know to see. He will remain there as long as he thinks we do not see. Those of you who know the opera by heart also know that neither line is in the final version of the opera. Debussy in particular suppressed all the lines where Mélisande was lying to Pelléas. I think these were very painful to him. So we can only guess whether Debussy's alterations were deliberate or unintended, a consequence of faulty memory. Sigmund Freud, of course, would argue that even if accidental, they were intended. There are, however, examples elsewhere in the sketch drafts where word substitution, typically of a synonym, was subsequently reversed with Maeterlinck's original text restored. Nevertheless, a few errors did creep into the sung text of the vocal score. I will not here speak about the more egregious engraver's errors that marred the full score, such absurdities as replacing le mur, the wall, with la mer, the sea, and having the willow branches thus hanging over the sea instead of hanging over the wall. Or my favorite is where vos cheveux become vous, and it's thus having Mélisande dive into the well rather than her hair dip into it. But once I was persuaded that Debussy had made an error rather than a revision, the mistake was easy to fix, provided the correct word contained the same number of syllables as the wrong one. For example, Mélisande means to say, I want to plunge my two hands into the water, not the two hands, mais instead of les. And when Golo speaks of the gloomy country, he means to refer to all its forests, all its old forests without light, not all these forests. Though in this case, the difference is inaudible to listeners, since it is between the French homonyms say, ses, and say, ces. Also, after Pelléas has been handling Mélisande's tresses, he means to say that he can no longer hold them with both hands, not that he cannot hold them with both hands. Ne plus instead of ne pas. One of the more worrisome of such situations comes during the love duet scene, when Pelléas describes how he sought beauty throughout the house and throughout the country. In the play, he says, Et maintenant, je t'ai trouvé, and now I have found you, I have found you. And so the line appears in every one of Debussy's manuscripts. But in every printed source, it is Et maintenant je t'ai trouvé, je l'ai trouvé. Now I have found you, I have found it, referring first to Mélisande and then, presumably, to the beauty that he had sought. Given the source situation, it might be very tempting to restore Maeterlinck's text. Yet, even if the reading in the printed score was the result of a misprint, it is impossible to imagine that Debussy would not have noticed and corrected it had he wished to do so. I therefore felt that I had to let it stand. Another such word substitution is problematic, because the restoration of what I consider to be the correct text removes a syllable and therefore a musical note. After Mélisande has lost her wedding ring in Blind Man's Well, Pelléas tries to make light of her apparently accidental yet symbolic severing of her marital ties to Golo. Ce n'est rien, it is nothing, he says. He then comments rather unrealistically, nous la retrouverons peut-être. We shall recover it, perhaps, before saying suggestively, ou bien nous en trouverons une autre, or else we will find another. The other being the ring that Pelléas imagines he might offer her. She in turn understands the seriousness of the loss, and while echoing his words, deflects his veiled hope for one found ring by referring in the plural to the rings they will never find. Non, non, nous ne la retrouverons plus. Nous n'en trouverons d'autres non plus. No, no, we shall never recover it. We shall never find any others either. In Pelléas's lines, but not in Mélisande's, Debussy failed to preserve the distinction between recovering and finding, as he uses the word retrouvant twice. Especially in view of the parallels between their two speeches, a correction of the score seems in order, though it involves the loss of one syllable and therefore a minor revision of the melodic line. And you don't mess around with Debussy's notes. Although Debussy may have aspired to make his libretto true to his text source, he was dealing with a moving target, since Maeterlinck published 2 revisions of his play during the 9 years between 1893, when Debussy began composing the opera, and 1902, when the vocal score was published. Debussy drew his libretto primarily from the original 1892 edition of the play, even retaining Mélisande's original song from the tower, Mes longs cheveux, fortunately, rather than Les Toiseuses Aveugles, the song with which Maeterlinck replaced it for the stage premiere and in subsequent editions of the play. Debussy did in fact adopt some readings from these subsequent editions, but not enough apparently to please the playwright. In anticipation of the opera's premiere, Maeterlinck protested the production. In a letter to Le Figaro, he complained that he had been denied his legitimate right to have his choice of singer for the role of Mélisande, that is to say, his mistress, Georgette Leblanc. And of course, his motivation was to please the lady at home. He didn't care at all about how the opera sounded. But he also attacked Debussy's libretto, which he charged had treated his play cavalierly. Quote, "Arbitrary and absurd cuts have been imposed, which have rendered it incomprehensible. Material has been kept that I intended to suppress or improve, as I have done in the edition that has just been published, in which it can be seen how much the text adopted by the Opera Comique differs from the authentic text. In a word, the Pelléas in question is a play that has become foreign to me, almost inimical. And stripped of all control over my work, I am reduced to wishing that its failure will be prompt and resounding." Of course, who is it who's remembered today? In any other circumstances, one might have sympathy for an author who had just undertaken an extensive revision of an early work, only to be reminded through public performances of the flaws that he had just weeded out. But Maeterlinck could hardly have expected Debussy at this very late stage, after the vocal score was already engraved, to make anything more than a few gestures towards incorporating his quite recent revisions, although he did. Here is one such instance. At the end of Act 1, Pelléas offers to guide Mélisande down the steep path to the castle, saying, "Voulez-vous me donner la main? Will you give me your hand?" A perhaps subconscious request for her hand in marriage. Mélisande's response in the original version of the play and in Debussy's original setting was to decline this offer, saying, "Voyez, voyez, j'ai les mains pleines." See, my hands are full. Because, of course, she's already married. In the revision of the play, Maeterlinck extended her line, "J'ai les mains pleines de fleurs et de feuillage," to indicate that her hands were full, she was holding flowers and foliage, thus giving her an explicit pretext for not offering her hand to Pelléas. This textual revision, which had made its first appearance in Maeterlinck's 1898 edition of the play, came to Debussy's attention after the vocal score had already been engraved. Nevertheless, he was able to squeeze in a portion of that added text, de fleur, as a proof correction. You can see it right there. In this slide, this is these proofs that were given to Jean Perrier that he learned the role from. So de fleur is not really written very clearly. It's just kind of sketched in so that he would know what Mary Garden was going to be singing. It was not Debussy's fault that so many years had intervened between his initial completion of the opera and its premiere, or that Maeterlinck was to become dissatisfied with his original play twice. By any reasonable standard, Debussy was exceptionally faithful to his text source, and his care even extended to the play's punctuation. Sometimes. Evidence of his concern over preserving it is found in the short score of Act 3. At one point, he went through the entire act, methodically supplying all missing punctuation with a black pencil. Unfortunately, this level of care was not consistently or even very often sustained. Punctuation was often lacking in the manuscripts, including those prepared for the engraver, and it was only haphazardly added to the proofs, often not by Debussy, or with reference to any authoritative source. In the grand scheme of things, this may be a relatively unimportant issue, but a critical edition needs to be concerned with such minutiae. And incorrect punctuation can alter the performance and, in small ways, the meaning. In two places, for example, questions have been incorrectly transformed into assertions or exclamations. In the opera's opening scene, Mélisande asks Golo if he is a giant. Vous êtes un géant? She doesn't exclaim that he is, and the singer needs to convey that it is a question. Similarly, when Mélisande cries, "Oh," after her ring falls into the well, no, that's still an exclamation. Pelléas hasn't seen what has happened, and he asks if it has fallen. Il est tombé? He doesn't exclaim it. In contrast, when Enold is crying out to the shepherd, trying to get his attention so that he may pose his final question, "Where are the sheep going?" he calls "Berger, berger," as exclamations, not as questions. Among the details that concerned me in preparing the critical edition was the use and reproduction of hyphens and dashes. In the original Froment edition, hyphens that connect words, such as êtes-vous or grand-père, are distinguished from hyphens that separate the syllables within words. And there you can see that. The former are reproduced in their normal position, while the latter are placed at the baseline, as in this example. Here, for the words esse, we see normal hyphens, whereas for the syllable divisions of the names Pelléas and Mélisande, the hyphens are at the baseline. Modern conventions do not make this distinction, and I just regret the loss, if only for sentimental reasons. Other problems attend the dash. In typographic terms, the M dash. Maeterlinck used the dash frequently to indicate breaks within a speech, places where the actor should introduce a pause. We can see a half dozen or so of them in Gollot's opening speech in Act 1, Scene 1 of the opera. This is Scene 2 in the play. And I must confess, this is reproduced from Maeterlinck's theater works. I didn't reproduce the first edition because I wrote too much on it, whereas this is clean. And the dash is different from the ellipsis, the three periods that indicate a trailing off at the end of a sentence or after an utterance, which Maeterlinck uses far more frequently. Examples abound in the exchanges between Gollot and Mélisande that follow. Even if, in editing the musical score, one were committed to respecting the playwright's text and punctuation in all its detail, it might be argued that these dashes need not be reproduced, that if the composer wished to observe the dash, he did so by inserting rests in the vocal melody, and that it would be unnecessary or redundant to represent these silences with punctuation. Nevertheless, this is precisely what Debussy did in his manuscripts. We lack the autograph vocal score of Act 1, but in the autograph short score of Gollot's opening speech, we can see that Debussy, well, I don't know if you can see, but he included the dashes, every single one of them. You can see, note in particular the dash, well, I don't think you can see, the dashes that separate the phrases in the bottom two systems of the page. Je crois que je me suis perdu moi-même. Et mes chiens ne me retrouvent plus. Je vais revenir sur mes pas. I believe that I am lost myself. My dogs can no longer find me. I shall retrace my steps. The dashes are the only punctuation after the first two of these phrases, and omitting them, as is unfortunately the convention in music publishing, creates an editorial dilemma. Should punctuation, whether commas or ellipsis, be inserted, imposing on them a grammatical coherence that reflects the editor's view of Debussy's interpretation, or should the text phrases be presented as the fragmentary, punctuation-less utterances that Maeterlinck wrote and that Debussy set? What I find curious and therefore interesting is Debussy's placement of these dashes in his autographs. Sometimes, as in the examples that you can't see, the dashes follow the phrases directly, as if to indicate that the words and thoughts break off. In some other places, they are simply positioned between the phrases, as we can see in this Pelléas' speech from the beginning of Act 2. There in the very bottom, first bar, you can see how he just has that dash kind of in the middle between those phrases. But at other times, they immediately precede the phrases that follow. And here, just look at the very third and fourth measures. It's a little bit, these are probably not the best cases, but at least they reproduced well. But the point that I want to make is that sometimes he has the dash right before the singer sings, suggesting the character pauses before starting to sing. In these cases, the vocal melody typically starts off the beat to reflect this pause or hesitation. And there we have some examples. Pelléas sings, Il paraît que c'était une fontaine miraculeuse. Tiré. Elle ouvrait les yeux des aveugles. Tiré. On l'appelle encore la fontaine des aveugles. It seems to have been a miraculous well. It opened the eyes of the blind. They still call it blind men's well. Again, it could be argued that it is unnecessary to reproduce these dashes in the printed score, since the musical notation represents them via rests. Nevertheless, Debussy's placement of the dashes tends to convey his interpretation of their meaning, and his decision to include them in his autographs reflects the importance that he attached to them. They were not merely included in his sketches, he also entered them in the fair copies for the engraver. And there's a page of the manuscript vocal score where you can still see all of those dashes. The engraver proceeded, of course, to ignore them, since they had no place in music notation conventions. Or perhaps they were misunderstood, mistaken for those extended baseline dashes that indicate when a final syllable is sung through a tied note, and the engraver therefore disregarded them when he judged that Debussy had just misplaced them. Given the theme of this conference, I have focused my comments relative to the critical edition of Pelléas on the opera's text, taking the narrowest possible meaning of that word, and even spending more time on the punctuation than on the text itself. But this is the nature of editorial work, to focus on minutiae. Although I am speaking from my experience of editing the vocal score, my observations also apply to the full score, in which the voice parts will be identical. Editing the vocal score as part of a collected works critical edition is itself problematic, doesn't matter, in view of the opera's complicated publication history. To state the problem simply, the editor has two essential choices: either to preserve Debussy's beautifully written piano accompaniment, even when it doesn't correspond to the full score, or to spoil Debussy's piano part by rewriting it so that it does reflect the revised orchestration presented in the critical edition of the full score. The aesthetics of the critical edition would favor the first option, but all practical considerations argue for the second. Above all, the vocal score is intended for study purposes. The singers use it to learn their parts, and they expect the piano accompaniment to prepare them for what they will hear when they eventually perform with the orchestra. To that end, I listened repeatedly to recordings of the opera to judge what should come through. And here I will say that Charles Dutoit's recording was especially helpful because of the clarity of the orchestral playing and the clarity of the recording. I shouldn't confess that. Perhaps I went too far and added or changed too much, owing to my personal obsession with the opera's leitmotifs. But I also had in mind those users who might rely on the vocal score to analyze or just simply study the opera. For them, I thought more information would be an advantage. I was also happy, though, to restore two bars that are missing from every previous vocal score in the interlude between scenes 3 and 4 of Act 3. I also reinstated as an option to performers two cuts in Golo's scene with Enold, the reference to the bed and whether Pelléas and Mélisande are near it, a passage that the censor insisted be removed, and Golo's original exit line with its implication that he and Enold will barge into the room and interrupt whatever it is that Pelléas and Mélisande are or aren't doing. Editing the vocal score was instructive in other ways, in that it helped me to correct errors or resolve ambiguities in the critical edition of the full score. But that will have to be a story for another day. Thank you very much.
For more information, please visit www.gresham.ac.uk.